So I would like to start, though, by offering my thanks to the college for release time to think more seriously about the tale of Genji, and the Annapolis faculty study group on that topic this last semester. I also want to thank Patricia Greer, who really was instrumental in inviting me into the world of Genji, and Sarah Klingenstein for inviting me into the world of Japanese poetry. Last but not least, I need to thank my children. My son Michael is here from Los Angeles for tonight, and my daughter Julia is a Santa Fe 2012 graduate. She couldn't be here tonight, but she did give me some notes ahead of time on what I needed to change about my lecture. So, the author, Murasaki Shikibu, wrote the Genji Monogatari in serial form during the first decade of the 11th century Common Era. The fictional narrative is set in the historical court of the capital of Japan, Kyoto, in the previous century. There is a nostalgic backward glance at a time of relative peace and prosperity before the dominance of the Fujiwara clan hollowed out the power of the imperial family. Within the story, the rise of the Fujiwara is seen in our peripheral vision, for the feminine narrator could not appropriately discuss political affairs. She could discuss marriage politics and the aesthetic accomplishments that made men, and especially women, valuable to their families in that arena. While given as an extended prose narrative, closely aligned with oral tradition and sources such as romances, ghost stories, and folk tales, the tale of Genji includes almost 800 short poems. Each chapter is laced through with waka, ancestors of haiku, that function primarily not as ornamental additions to the story, but as zotoka, as written or spoken conversations that can drive the plot as much as the prose does. People talk to each other through poetic exchanges, often with sophisticated allusions to a tradition of poetry known by heart. Imperially sponsored anthologies provided templates for spontaneous composition. The other companion texts taken for granted by the tale of Genji are Buddhist sutras, especially the Lotus Sutra. I bring this up because, for example, when we read the Brothers Karamazov, we assume Christianity, and we take note of the brothers' different attitudes towards it. Here, Shinto nature practices and Buddhist teachings provide a similar context for the characters' experiences. The plot and narrative style. Since some of you have not yet read this, I want to give a brief summary of the plot. The 54 chapters follow Genji, favorite son of the emperor, through his life and loves, and extends to the next 2 generations, showing us the brevity of human life. At the same time, it highlights the cultivation of deep sensitivity to the present moment. Since the story is set in peacetime, the arena for masculine competition was courtship. Genji's amorous adventures are situated in seasonal time with detailed descriptions of weather, clothes, and rituals. While the narrator tells stories in the past tense and the third person, sometimes she slides over to allow a character's thoughts or emotional reactions become prominent. The playfulness of this free indirect speech strategy provokes irony. Readers become aware of themselves as readers, changing their minds about characters and events. The shifting temporal atmosphere contributes to the intensity of feeling within the narrative and to the reader's distance from or closeness to the action. The narrative voice uses honorifics and/or humbling language to address or describe herself, her object, and her supposed audience. She assumes middle-rank court women who are privy to ever-circulating court gossip to be her primary readers. This places us in her social rank, but allowed imperial readers to enjoy imagining themselves outside the pressures their status carried with it. Genji, the radiant prince, was known for a wide-ranging taste in women and subsequent loyalty and support for them, even when his eye wandered elsewhere. Throughout his life, he sought substitutes for a mother he never knew, while benefiting from a polygamous social situation where men of the very highest classes were permitted to have several wives, mistresses, and casual flings. The first half of the book follows him on erotic escapades, wherein the more risky or strange the circumstances, the more intriguing he found them. Exile followed this behavior after Genji slept with one of the new emperors, his brother's women. The characters outlining his emotional and aesthetic experience of exile are among the most beautifully written. Genji returned to the court, ascended ever higher in rank, and finally achieved his political goals through his children. Yet there is no way to stave off death and suffering. The second half of the book strikes a darker view of human life among his offspring and relatives, influenced by the Buddhist view of Mappo, the end times, of non-adherence to the words of Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. Words and gestures become empty, and we see characters fail to achieve the glory that once deemed Genji a manifestation of Buddha in our midst. Within the narrative, the female characters achieve fully realized lives that did not depend solely on their relation to their fathers and husbands. For example, Genji's true love, Murasaki, was a protagonist who exhibited bodhisattva-like compassion and generosity. This is a rough summary of a book spanning more than 1,000 pages in English translation. What can we learn from a social world with very different values, concerns, and marital arrangements? Not that we want more rigid power hierarchies, more misogyny or sequestering of women, but we might well gain some qualitative sense of other ways of becoming human, especially with an eye to aesthetic practices. By this I mean making ourselves into works of art, experiencing the world as a beautiful place, and fashioning it to intensify its aesthetic contrasts to share with others. What if we made creative play, ritual, and watching snow fall more important to who we are? What if we acknowledged more overtly the importance of perception and imagination in our coming to know ourselves, the world, and our responsibilities towards others? I will focus on the material and poetic features of becoming human that bring us face to face with change as the fundamental character of life. This narrative is more attentive to what is transitory than what is fixed, as shown also by the fact that neither the author nor the characters have names. All the names we use for convenience sake were given by readers or translators based on where the characters lived, flowers they resembled, or their rank and title. Names changed as they rose in rank. A certain prince, born to the emperor and a minor consort, was removed from the line of succession and made a Genji, a commoner in the Minamoto clan. We might translate Genji Monogatari as the narrative or story of the commoner, since his father hoped he would be of use in government without challenging his older brother for the throne. Even the author's retrospective pen name is Murasaki, after her most beloved character, and Shikibu, after her father's court rank as an authority on ritual ceremonies. We will look at 3 different approaches at how we become human, while at the same time intertwined with the temporal and spatial dimensions of our natural habitat. The way of detachment, as represented by hair, is in tension with the way of attachment, as represented by clothes. The way of skillful means, signified by the writing brush, embraces both of them as complementary rather than contradictory ways. Hair. As a natural product of all mammals, hair keeps growing without our attention or will. Our hair develops through pre-personal processes, yet in every human context, hair is styled to indicate age, marital availability or status, to frighten others, or to seduce them. To become human, one does something with one's hair. In the tale of Genji, aristocratic boys, and oops, holy cow, this is jumping way ahead, just a second. Well, we'll just stay here for a minute, there we go. Aristocratic boys and some girls arranged their hair in 2 loops beside their ears. After initiation into adulthood between ages 11 and 14, this cute style was abandoned. Here is a description of the protagonist's initiation ritual. The lambent glow of his face, which was still framed on either side by the twin loops of his boyish hairdo, made his father, the Emperor of Japan, feel all the more regretful about the change in appearance that was about to take place. The honor of trimming back Genji's hair fell to the minister, whose face betrayed the pain he felt the moment he cut Genji's beautiful locks. His Majesty had fretted that cutting his locks and putting his hair up in the style of an adult man would spoil his looks. To his amazement, the ceremony only added to Genji's aura of masculine beauty. At that moment, the cutting of hair meant that the boy left the feminine world of women and young children to join the men in a social world segregated by gender. That same evening, Genji was married to Aoi, daughter of Minister of the Left, even though he was 12 and she 16, strangers to one another. The 2 fathers acknowledged the commitment in a performative exchange of vows, a prime example of marriage politics. His Majesty composed a waka, quote, "When you with purple cords first bound his hair, did you not also bound your heart and swear eternal vows to give him your daughter?" And the minister responded in kind. "So long as the deep purple of these cords that bind our hearts as tightly as your son's hair never fade, so our mutual vow will retain its deep hue." Note the play on the verb to bind up hair, musubu, which can also mean to vow marriage fidelity, and the word for purple, murasaki, the color of close relationships. Genji's hair tied up in an adult style acted as the commitment between the elders as well as an indicator of his own age and station. Henceforth, his long hair would be tied in a bun, crowned with a hat. The narrative gives more attention to feminine hair, one of the primary erotic zones for Genji and other men. I should note that courtship rituals were elaborate and difficult, given the cloistering of women who were never seen by men other than their fathers, husbands, or young children. Suitors had to guess from the sound of the voice, the scent of clothes, possibly their handwriting or touch on a musical instrument, not only how accomplished, but how beautiful they must be, hidden behind blinds and curtains in unlit rooms. Even after a seduction was successful, when a man visited a woman at home at night and slept with her 3 nights in a row to signify marriage, he might only know what she looked like through touch in a very dark chamber. Touch therefore privileged the long, silky hair of the aristocratic woman. By long, I mean longer than they were tall, possibly 6 feet or so. Hair's growth gave evidence of the security or anxiety a woman felt, like the rings of a tree show good times and bad years of drought. As hair started to thin through aging or grief, several female characters began to think of themselves as unsightly. Yet men like Genji found this marker of bodily vulnerability to be quite moving and attractive. One particularly poignant episode featured the safflower princess. She was of imperial birth and as such had very few options for a marriage on her level. She was an orphan living in an increasingly dilapidated villa, seemingly abandoned by her lover, Genji. Her prideful aunt urged her to move with her family to a provincial post, but grudgingly took away instead the princess' closest companion, Jeju, who had been nursed along with the safflower princess and had remained with her to adulthood. This was a rupture in their intimate relationship, for it was unlikely they would ever see each other again. The princess brought forth farewell gifts, a jar of old valuable incense to perfume robes, and a coiled 9-foot-long braid of hair. It is likely that Jeju had combed the princess' hair and collected the strands that remained in the comb, which were braided into this hairpiece. The princess's hair extension was not just a trace of the time they had spent together, but was a gift of herself. It could stand in for her embodied being as a memento, a katami. When Jeju missed her, she would be able to stroke the braid or wear it in honor of her companion. In distinction from hairstyles that are signs of a state, married or unmarried, for example, the safflower princess's gift was not a symbol, but the thing itself. In some way, the princess sought to remain close through the living force of her hair. This keepsake, katami, had a magical potency in its contact with the relationship that was cut off by Jeju's physical departure. This was private ritual behavior, which suggests something about the psychological state of the giver. Washing and combing functioned as precursors to mourning through the gathering of shed hair. Jeju would belong to a husband instead of to the safflower princess, who was loyal to a past, to ancient furniture, and a ruined home. Her hope that Genji, when returned from exile, would remember her hung by a slender thread. In chapter 51, there is a detailed account of the process of hair washing. It took a long time to comb and dry such long hair, so women listened to stories being read aloud and looked at related pictures while having their hair combed. The handwritten form of the Genji Monogatari was often accompanied by albums or scrolls of pictures of each chapter. Several women could look at the pictures and project emotions on the rather neutral faces of the people in the images. These images are not simple illustrations, but can be considered supplements that exceed the words on the page. When Genji was off in pursuit of pleasure, Murasaki, our feminine protagonist, turned to Monogatari, which she defined as, quote, old stories about what happens in life, full of women involved with fickle, wanton, or treacherous men, but each one seems to find her own in the end. How strange it is, this insecure life I have led. Am I to end my days burdened with these miseries that other women too find hateful and unendurable? Murasaki compared her life with the heroines in these fictional narratives, just as later readers would gather insight from the Genji Monogatari. Moments of interpretation would be welcome as readers or viewers in a group discussed the events in the ongoing narrative. The activities of reading aloud, looking at pictures, discussing, combing hair, and emotionally reacting to stories were intimately intertwined in the feminine experience in the private recesses of Heian court life. Tangled hair, midare, suggests female erotic passion and is connected with images and words for sea tangle, the seaweed washed ashore, and of course with love entanglements. While in exile near the sea at Suma, Genji discovered that sea tangle was burned and laboriously harvested for salt. Like other poets, he then associated it with salt tears, the foremost product of love and longing. But tangled hair is also related to death and the powerful emotions leading to it. The high-ranking Rokujo lady, a lover who resented Genji's disrespect and his subsequent taking up of a new, lower-ranked lover, Yugao, acted out her resentment by entering Yugao's body to kill her in the midst of a tryst. That death is vividly brought to mind, but is not painted, in a disturbing image of Yu Gao's tangled hair tumbling out of the mat rolled around her body on the way to a secret cremation. The resentful Rojuko lady came back as an angry ghost later in the book to haunt Murasaki, bringing her close to death. The ghost moved into a medium described as a weeping figure with her hair over her face. And though her form was distorted, she accused Genji, "You are still the same you who always refused to know." I agree with its assessment, since Genji's refusal to acknowledge Murasaki's negative feelings also contributed to her demise. One of the concepts in Japanese aesthetics is kire, to cut, to be broken off as of a relationship, to have severed ties, but also to be free or to begin something new. As a noun, it means a cutting, as of a plant, a piece cut off, or a scrap of cloth. This concept shows a kind of violence woven through natural forces in human relations. The cutting of hair comes to mean the cutting off of femininity within the realm of eros and of familial responsibilities. A woman who became a nun enacted that profound change by cutting off her lifetime of hair to the shoulders. Not simply a sign for others, her gesture was the crossing of a threshold that bound her forever to spiritual practices. Lay nuns remained at home. Those who moved to mountain retreats might cut their hair even shorter, eliminating the main focus of their feminine beauty. Genji was very angry when his second wife, the third princess, cut her hair shortly after childbirth, yet he had no choice but to provide her with all the material accessories for religious practice, such as incense burners, copies of the Lotus Sutra, and new hangings, so that her platform bed would become an altar. Without speaking a word, one might display one's status as in this world but not of it, of dedication to practices focused on the afterlife or on the alleviation of others' suffering in this one. Thinking about hair suggests natural growth and involvement in a wider world. The cut, kire, evokes death, whether of a cut branch of a plant or the renunciation of human attachments. Yet pruning promotes the health of a plant or tree. A cutting may be the basis for the rooting of a new plant. Similarly, one might cut hair and embrace a religious life as a way to flee the pressures of the old life, like the third princess, or to cut away distractions, and like the Bodhisattva canon, to compassionately hear the cries of the world. There could also be some joy in renunciation for lay practitioners. Aesthetic considerations still held sway, especially in ritual and in musical performance, which could embody a paradise on earth, a substitute for the imagined pure land of Buddha. Clothes. We turn to clothes as a way to enhance our ability to pay attention to color and texture, as a foundation for noticing others' suffering and for developing a compassionate response. As depicted in the tale of Genji, clothes bring together the tactile, visual, and aural components of perception. An 18th century critic, Motori Norinaga, brought the concept of mono no aware to bear on his interpretation of Genji Monogatari. The aware, the pathos, the misery, the sorrow of mono, of things, was extended in his hands to a heightened sensitivity for the affective components of all existence. The weeping willow tree, just as much as a stream meandering around rocks or a young girl adjusting her sash, may offer a poignant event. We can consider the feelings things display, but also the affect we notice in ourselves, of empathy or pity for the evanescent beauty of a flower or a child. While the tale of Genji does not adhere to a Zen-like austerity, the splendor in clothes and elaborate rituals still reveals an emptiness at the heart of things. Sorrow at life's continual changes intensifies the experience of appreciation of the present moment. In structure, the T-shaped kimono had an overlapping front with an attached neckband held closed by cords, a belt, or a sash. The basic kimono template was the same for men and women, made of silk in an array of colors and brocade patterns for the highest classes. Multiple robes were worn over a simple chemise and colorful trousers tied with a cord. Heian men's clothing might have differences in collar and color combinations, but everyone would heed the change of season twice a year, from lightweight silk gauze fabrics that kind of stood away from the body to promote air circulation, to warmer silk padded kimonos with more layers. Clothing was changed according to a ritual calendar that anticipated seasons, whether the temperature had changed or not. Dark gray morning clothes had to be exchanged for a lighter gray or even subdued colors after a specified time period, despite the depth of grief. The very act of changing clothing contributed to a sense that life would continue. The clothes insisted that one turn attention to the rhythm of the garden and the court, experiencing a pleasure in the new season intertwined with a melancholy knowledge of its brief stay. Getting dressed was a social event in the ritualized context of the Japanese court. Layered clothing showed style, rank, and adherence to tradition and occasion. Men's outermost robe color signified their rank and changed within a codified palette when they advanced in the court hierarchy. Women wore more layers. At the height of the Heian period, the so-called 12-layer robe had as many as 20 layers, making it difficult to walk or raise one's arms. An imperial decree reduced the number to 5 layers to lighten the burden, but that decree postdates the tale of Genji. Its supplemental images show women weighed down by their hair sitting in a puddle of fabric. Since the kimono shape was highly conservative for both men and women, with gradual changes in sleeve volume, the main fashion innovations were in color and pattern. The flat planes of the garments allowed for experimentation in combining colors. Brocades were woven of 2 different hues that would visually cancel each other out to produce a third 3-dimensional texture, while silver or gold threads enhanced the reflective capacity to an overall lighter effect. The range of colors was wide and subtle, drawing on all natural dyes from plant flowers and leaves, roots, or minerals. A contrasting obi, a sash, or outerwear reinforced interactions between colors through their juxtapositions. A sash also mitigated the blurring of colors, softly influencing each other by providing a harder edge. Spatial closeness to merging was offset by the suggestion of more distance between the belt and the robe, and generated shadows. 12-layer robes produced compound colors when sheer fabrics of different hues overlapped. One popular style that Genji endorsed was cherry blossom, a transparent white layer over red, yielding a subtle shifting pink effect that was significantly different from a single layer of pink cloth. The overlapping fabrics not only changed value and light intensity, but created apparent spatial distance as well. Nothing is just one color, because apparent hue changes in light and shadow, in juxtaposition with other colors, or in being perceived as symbolically laden. Clothing demonstrates that everything we perceive is laced through with illusion. It gives us immediate, direct experience of change. In the Genji Monogatari, robes interchangeably performed in the invisible and often undescribed human body. In one dramatic example, the married woman, later called Cicada Shell, heard the rustle of Genji's clothes as he unexpectedly entered her room one night. She abandoned the light robe on which she was sleeping and retreated deeper into the house. Genji took the robe to sleep with, redolent of her, and wrote to her the next morning this poem. Empty cicada, molting you have left your shell at the foot of the tree. Still I shall recall how sweet was the self within the husk. The spirit, Tama, of the person was said to reside in the garment, not as a Christian soul within the human body, but woven into the husk as well. Tama in the indigenous Shinto tradition is a power that infuses the inanimate as well as the animate. Sleeping with someone else's clothing expressed frustrated longing, while an exchange of clothing between lovers acted as a merging of their embodied beings. Another episode speaks to the importance of kimono sleeves as a means of social expression. Genji was invited to join a procession to the Kamo shrine to honor the Shinto kami, the gods. He and his retinue were, quote, brilliant in looks and finery until it seemed as though the very trees and grasses must bow down before a beauty so universally admired, end quote. The entire city turned out for the parade, including many of Genji's ladies who had a rare chance to see him on horseback in broad daylight. First Avenue was overcrowded with women's closed carriages, each with colorfully layered sleeves draping on the outside to indicate who might be within. Kimono sleeve and hem lengths varied with each additional robe so that the colors and pattern of underlayers would be visible right at the edges of garments. Genji, of course, gave a smiling glance in the direction of a few ladies he recognized by their sleeves. His pregnant wife, Aoi, arrived late. Her inebriated men jostled the Rokujo ladies' carriage out of the way, and as the fabulously attired Genji passed by, he acknowledged his wife with profound deference. His casual disregard of the higher-ranked Rokujo lady had fatal consequences, since her sleeves, if not her face, sustained public shaming. Recall that her spirit once left her unwitting body to torture her rival, Yugao. Now she had even less personal control over her resentful Tama when Aoi delivered a healthy baby boy. Her spirit spoke privately to Genji, who dismissed her anger. Within days, Aoi was dead, leaving the newborn Yugari as a keepsake, as a katami. We might think that the two women who clashed over public recognition by Genji in the carriage incident would primarily resent each other, yet both had reason to focus their strong, violent emotions towards the self-indulgent man who minimized their suffering. Resentment is one of the most common descriptors of the sequestered women who, however lovely and adept at self-cultivation, had little control over their own lives. Genji came and went as he wanted and prided himself on financially supporting his ladies. His refusal to take responsibility for their physical or psychological suffering, even when he could see their thinning hair or mourning clothes, is described in detail by the narrative voice. The narrative speaks directly to her audience, to us. Up to this point, I had refrained from exposing all his messy, sordid affairs, which he tried so hard to keep hidden from prying eyes. I did so because I felt sorry for him, but then people started criticizing me, saying that my account was so much fiction, and asking me, is it because he's the child of an emperor that people like you who know him feel compelled to sing his praises as if he were perfect in every way? Well, now I suppose that by exposing his transgressions, I will be censured for having said too much. This interjection situates the narrative as if in a real world where people talk to the narrator about the hero. After all the ghostly uncanniness, this direct address reintegrates the audience as characters within the court world. Note that ghosts and angry spirits are on the same level of reality, though in private spaces. The spooky stories / sordid affairs are surrounded by the audience's criticism and followed by the narrator's meta response, anticipating more grumbling that she is making things up. The ongoing fictional narrative that reinforces apparent verisimilitude is likewise distinct from the real world of the 11th century author, not to mention the 21st century readers. But let's jump back in. The rough, stiff clothes Murasaki made for Genji in exile connoted the misery in being stripped of rank, usually marked by the colors that signaled one's position. The physical removal from the city, from duties and titles, was made concrete through his change in clothing. Genji's way was no longer smooth. Rough silk made that texture of life evident against his skin and to the eyes of others. While struggling with his loss of identity, Genji brought consolation to the men who went into exile with him. His frequent tears expressed the yearning of all the exiles, but were also tears of appreciation for the beauty of the place that incorporated them in an ensemble of sound, scent, and color. Genji's clothes expressed and enhanced an aesthetic fit made more intense by his affective alignment with the feelings of things. Upon recall to the capital, Genji was given clothing as mementos to hold the Akashi shore and his new lover there in mind. Genji's robes had a note from the newly pregnant Akashi lady, quote, "These layered travel robes I cut and sewed for you in a place where the waves roll in. Will they displease you for having been washed with salt water and my tears?" Genji managed a hasty reply, "Keepsakes, katami, each to each should our inner garments be, for that time between the estranging web of days before we join again." Inner layer robes can also kachire can also refer to the colors generated by the layering of sheer fabrics, further suggesting the mingling effect of one with the other. Inner garments were more intimate than the outer robes and thus acknowledged hidden, deeper connections. Genji, quote, "in return gave her the robes he had been wearing. They would likely be a memento, a katami, that added yet another layer to the yearning she would inevitably feel for him. The scent of his perfume, which permeated his incomparably stylish clothing, would surely cling as well to the heart of the Akashi lady." Here I detect an ironic flavor in the description of Genji's self-flattery and lack of concern for the provincial woman. He was undoubtedly beyond compare for the way he glowed radiantly, no matter whether he was dressed in the height of courtly fashion or a traveler's cloak or the rough silk of the unranked exile. As an exile, his task was to pray and practice austerities to overcome his offenses in this life or the past. Yet, as the translator Dennis Washburn describes him, Genji had an instinctive urge to pursue dangerous liaisons, regardless of the likely scandal. Challenging boundaries heightened the intensity of his feelings of self-regard and made renunciation of erotic pleasures a long-deferred dream. He was blind to women's feelings because he was always seeking a repetition or a substitution of an earlier love. For example, Genji imagined that Murasaki would take the place of her aunt Fujitsubo, the off-limits consort of his father by whom he had a child. Genji's father, the emperor, had likewise chosen Fujitsubo as a memento of Genji's deceased mother because of their similar appearance. We can trace a genealogy of resemblances. Murasaki brought to mind Fujitsubo as she grew to look more and more like her. When Fujitsubo cut her hair to become a nun, Genji had no longer had an easy way to approach her, but she continued to stand in his mind for the mother he had no recollection of at all. These relationships were built on imagination more than perception. We can grant that Genji's life had loss at its root, a cutting off of maternal nurture that haunted him. Yet obsessive replacement of the object of desire denied loss and was ultimately futile. As we become human, we learn to pay attention and discern differences, to recognize and create patterns of events, behaviors, and ideas. Perceiving differences in colors, for instance, grounds the possibility of more nuanced feelings. I claimed that sensitive attention would promote compassion for others' suffering, but I must qualify that conclusion. A refined sensibility could promote compassion. Genji did not apply his exquisite sensibility to the women in his life when it really mattered. By clinging to a strategy of substitutions, he lost the Rokujo lady, Yugao, Aoi, and finally Murasaki to the forces of anger and resentment. Our protagonist remained convinced that, quote, it was his karmic destiny to fully experience every hardship of the heart. And he failed to fully grasp the fundamental insight of mono no aware, all things change. The concept kire, to cut, which in the context of hair we associated with cutting off attachments to early childhood in masculine initiation rituals, or to separation from familial life by spiritual renunciation, is in tension with the concept of mono no aware, which calls for deeper affective engagement with the ephemeral present. There is a seed of joy in the heart of detachment. There is a seed of sorrow in the heart of attachment. But each of these ways has a prominent tone that conflicts with the other. Brush. When we turn to the writing brush, which coincidentally is made of animal hair seated in a bamboo holder, we can see how writing and reading can enact close contact and empathy, or distancing irony that allows for critique of the protagonist and the conventions of his social world. Aesthetic transformation of common experience leads to affect, since readers can confront their own experience presented in a structured way that gives shape to a continual flow. By leaving much unstated, the text invites participation. We recognize repeating patterns within the narrative, but also their resonances within our own very different lives. The narrative's preference for allusive description is even more prominent in the poetry. Often leaving out the subject of a sentence, merely gesturing in the direction of a topic, the poems convey more than their explicit words do. English translators have to make decisions that make the poems less allusive. We've seen examples of short poems as performative exchange, such as Genji and Aoi's fathers sealing their marriage. I want here to focus on the ways drawings and written poetry and prose act as witnesses to experience and help us clarify what we think and feel. We will look at 3 examples: Murasaki's individual writing practice, the shared event of Genji's exilic hand scroll, and the place of the Lotus Sutra. These 3 approaches to brushwork are suggestive with respect to the problem of attachment. 1. When Genji first met Murasaki, aged 10, she did not yet write cursive, which was the basis for her grandmother's rejection of his marriage proposal. Cursive handwriting enabled the sensory expression of nuanced adult feelings. One learned to write by copying and thereby memorizing key poems from the imperial anthologies. As he wrote to little Murasaki, Genji adapted his noble masculine penmanship to a clear, connected model of youthful feminine handwriting and folded each letter into a tiny knot. Her women insisted that she imitate his writing in her copybook so that she always had his hand before her. After he abducted Murasaki to make her into the perfect wife, Genji directly supervised her brushwork. Her childish but rich and gentle brushstrokes gradually developed into an impressive woman's hand. Throughout her life, Murasaki continued to copy old poems in private moments and found that they would evoke, quote, whatever weighed on her mind, and she would then read her own preoccupation in them, end quote. Her deep reservoir of memorized poetry and stories generated image and word associations, much like dreams aid psychoanalysis. Within the spaciousness of the 31-syllable waka poem, there was room for recall and refinement of feelings. The waka's two-part structure offered a question or an enigmatic observation about the world in a 5-7-5-syllable introduction, followed by a 7-7-syllable response. The caesura highlights the tension between the two parts, while the two halves of the poem can be bridged by word associations. Another strategy, soku, or distant linking, operates through ambiguous allusions, leaving a space, ma, as an interval for the breath and life. Ultimately, there was an ineffable surplus in this seemingly simple form that made room for Murasaki within the heritage of communal use. As if a place to improve handwriting, her paper acted as an arena of integration of old and new poetry. Her reflective poems added to the cluster of writing samples strewn around her desk and had a regenerative effect on the group. Writing practice can thus be practiced in cursive skill in writing clearly or with feeling, and in the composition of one's interior life. Since narrative and poetic forms precede and outlive the original writers, readers can develop sensitivity to their own temporal and spatial connections with others who use language. We are expanded by this network of relations, which can alleviate the fear and anxiety that results from a resistance to change. Murasaki approached her death with a beautiful woman's hand and contentment supported by her experience with writing practice. Our second example. Genji's poetry, writing style, and imagery reached its height in the scrolls he made in exile in Suma and Akashi. He expressed contact with the world around him and his genuine affect far more immediately than in his seductive morning after letters and other social communications. Those were often sophisticated ensembles of special papers, calligraphy, and decorations, such as a cut branch of plum blossom attached to the outside of a carefully folded missive. Virtuosos of calligraphy, like Genji, adopted different styles to suit the mood, message, and that of the season and the recipient. Classical Japanese poems have no linguistic gender marking, nor do they use honorific language that instantiates class relationships, thus opening a counterfactual space for contact in a hierarchical social situation. Calligraphy thus exceeded the hand. Genji could write like a woman, like a scholar, like a scribe of the Lotus Sutra, like the imperial son that he was. Recipients were by turns charmed, in awe, or intimidated, depending on his style and intention. On the other hand, the extended format of a hand scroll made by pasting papers end to end indefinitely enabled a different, more participatory kind of reading. Japanese writing is arranged in vertical columns, read from top to bottom, from right to left. By unrolling a scroll to the left as one rolls up the right-hand portion that has already been seen, new vistas or ideas come into view. The flexible format allows readers to go at their own pace, to roll backwards, to reinterpret an image or narrative passage in light of new knowledge, altering sensations of spatial and temporal flow. We imagine Genji's exile scrolls to have been created over a couple of years, with both poems and images reflective of the changes in the look of the seashore in different seasons and weather. He left spaces for Murasaki to write her responses to his poems, projecting his unfilled longing towards a future together. Meanwhile, at home, Murasaki was writing and drawing her own scroll of longing, hoping for a time when she could share the scope of her feelings with Genji. The same brush and ink rendered the words and the pictures, which reinforced each other in the moment. The couple continued to exchange letters throughout his exile, but these narratives were meant to be a continuous record of yearning. Once Genji returned to the capital, a picture contest was arranged, modeled on historical poetry competitions. Two of His Majesty's consorts vied to hold the artistic young emperor's interest, one backed by her father, To no Chujo, Genji's best friend and rival, and the other sponsored by Genji. To no Chujo's daughters, Team of the Right, brought out spectacular modern images, including new commissions by professional painters and calligraphers. The Team of the Left had as their secret resource Genji's amateur journal of the time away from court. The judges and the witnesses were deeply moved by Genji's scroll as they were transported to the remote locations and Genji's sensitive perspective in exile. Murasaki had a more distant reaction to his scroll. She realized that while she was making her testament to her own sense of exile, her husband was impregnating the Akashi lady. The Team of the Left won, without question, though the event revealed to the reader an increasing distance between Genji and his beloved Murasaki. Genji sensed but did not want to explore her disaffection, preferring to keep her image as a compliant and supportive companion. After her death, Genji wanted Murasaki's letters to him in exile burned. Oddly, the ink was still vivid and could be mementos, katami, for 1,000 years, even if he were not around to read them. His gentlewomen glimpsed among their folds, quote, words describing the depths of her despair over their separation, which enhanced their own mourning. Notice the temporal nesting. One can imagine the letters, like Genji Monogatari, outlasting the readers. Within the wide scope of the letters, we find a sequence of first reception in Suma, saved as mementos, Murasaki's death, partial rereading, nostalgia and mourning, and a projection of Genji's own death. All this is recorded by multiple points of view. Before they were destroyed, Genji added a margin note, quote, I shall have no joy from gathering sea-tangled traces of her brush. Let them rise above the clouds as she also rose in smoke. He evoked the sea tangle from Suma's shore with resonant associations of the tangled hair of passionate love and the pattern of drifting smoke from crematory fires. With these final words, her living handwriting was reduced to ash. Unlike clerical-style copies of the Lotus Sutra, Midare calligraphy enacts emotional extremes. Midare means to fall into chaos. Like tangled hair, tangled writing that gives up on orderly columns and starts to trace over itself in rapidly spiraling fashion, soon shows the urgency of love and death. We can soon no longer make sense of what is being said, but we can see the anguish. The paper of the 12th century Genji Monogatari Emaki already had a certain depth, given the embellishment of gold and silver flecks and slivers, but the calligraphy added the sensation of increasing spatial layers in snarls of black ink. It didn't describe despair, it enacted despair. Reginald Jackson says that the calligraphy here, quote, performed kinesthetically the labor of trying to outstrip death's hold on the body straining to write, end quote. This is not Genji or Murasaki's brushwork, but the narrative itself, straining to write and picture the unimaginable, a text, a world without the beloved. One last example. The Lotus Sutra asserts that it is a substitute for Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. Reading and copying it is equivalent to being within the book, sitting next to the Buddha himself. His physical presence has been transformed into a text that surprisingly features different kinds of writing, including stories and parables, causal explanations, and sermons in both poetry and prose. They all fall under the heading of skillful means, hoben, ways to reach readers tailored to them. The Lotus Sutra says, quote, if there are living beings who do not understand the roots of suffering, who are deeply attached to the causes of suffering and are unable to give them up, for their sake, the Buddha uses skillful means to teach the way. We are told that we ourselves are capable of becoming Buddhas or of acting as bodhisattvas who witness and alleviate the suffering in this world. Should we find that hard to believe, the sutra employs hoben, skillful or expedient means, to say the same thing in a different way. For instance, a parable presents striking imagery in a compact story that we may find easier to grasp than a long sermon. The parable of the plants likens the Buddha's words to rain that falls on the root systems of various kinds of plants in the amount and to the depth they can each absorb. All are nourished by the rain, just as different portions of the Lotus Sutra sustain readers. Unlike a monotheistic religion, Japanese Buddhism puts forward many replications of the primary focus, the man Shakyamuni. Within the Lotus Sutra, we see him sit right next to Abundant Treasures Buddha, same place, same time, as he assures his disciples that they too will achieve this level of enlightenment. The multiplication of Buddhas transcends the notion of katami, for they are not mementos of one who has died or substitutions for the real thing. We ask, how can the radiant Genji, who displayed his self-absorbed, obsessive behavior, sorry but I have to say it, really be a Buddha among us? In his paradoxical beauty and resistance to change, he holds up a mirror to cut through the reader's illusions about ourselves, a first step towards enlightenment. Is the tale of Genji an implicit replication of the Lotus Sutra, a writing that replicates the human Shakyamuni Buddha? As a text that is a complex examination of the transitory nature of existence, including our mortal lives and the relationships we forge, the Monogatari may bring us to a realization of emptiness and the interdependence of all things. It may also act as a ground clearing for us to imagine a very different future for ourselves, depending on our receptivity. At the very least, as one of the first editors of Genji Monogatari, Fujiwara Teika claimed, reading it carefully makes one's mind more clear and one's poetry improve in style. Legend has it that the author, Murasaki Shikibu, while on a monastery retreat, began writing her first chapter on the paper closest to hand, the backside of a copy of the Lotus Sutra. The way of Kire, cutting off attachment and distancing ourselves. The way of Mono no Oware, of nuanced sensitivity for the pathos of things and our intertwining with them. The way of Hoben, or skillful means, of readers' participation in the uncompleted Monogatari, the unfinished Akashi scroll, the reiteration of the Lotus Sutra, the continuing conversation. Each of these ways can lead to a felt sense of our real place in the world as an embodied sight of coming into being and passing away that is at the same time loss-filled and beautiful.